Hello class, this is Professor Bay, and today we're going to be talking about Neocolonialism on Chapter 7. And you will see this period is dominated by foreigners in Latin America, especially the English and the US later on. So, neocolonialism, the major Latin American cities became modern metropolises. They had streetcars, telephones, silent movies in places like Montevideo, Santiago, Mexico City, and Havana. So Montevideo in Uruguay, Santiago in Chile, Mexico City in Mexico, and Havana in Cuba. Railroads multiplied and they built a lot of miles of railroad, and they will carry tons of exported goods like sugar, coffee, copper, grain, nitrate, tin, cacao, rubber, bananas, beef, wool, and tobacco. Even beef later on gets exported all the way to Europe because they come up with the refrigerators to store them. Landowners and urban middle class people became prosperous, and while the rest of the rural majority improved very little. So you will see that a small amount of minority really benefits from all this progress and foreign investment, and the majority does not benefit from it at all. Progress brought new imperialism from Britain and the United States. Foreign influence was so powerful in Latin America that historians call this period the Neo-Colonial Period from 1880 to 1930. And the hierarchy didn't change very much in terms of race and class, but the new people who were the superiors at the top were the English and the people from the United States. The great export boom happens. The elite and the middle class in Latin America had a lot to gain from this progress from the export boom. Mexican exports grew by 900% between 1877 and 1910, with sugar, silver, coffee, and fibers. Brazil was producing two-thirds of the coffee that was consumed in the world, in the entire world. Two-thirds of the coffee. And Brazilian coffee is really good. You guys should really try it. It's one of the best, and all over Latin America, they always have Brazilian coffee. Cuba was with sugar, and Chile with copper and nitrates and iron. Argentina with wheat. Later on with beef, you will see the beef industry will grow very much with the creation of refrigerators. Guatemala had coffee, Honduras had bananas, Ecuador has cacao, and Bolivia had tin mines. The railroad tracks went from 2,000 to 59,000 miles between 1870 and 1900. So you can see in 30 years how many miles it grew and how much faster these goods were being transported from place to place. The beneficiaries were landowners and the middle class city dwellers. The middle class grew very fast between 1880 and 1930. Argentina in 1930, for example, only represented a quarter to a third of the population middle class. By the 1900s in Mexico, 1 million middle class people worked as clerks, and a third of a million as cooks, laundresses, and shoemakers, and policemen, and so on. But 8 million people, 8 million country people, mostly indigenous, with one change of clothes, worked in the agricultural fields. So the majority is living poor and living in, working as in the agricultural fields. So the minority was the one that was benefiting from all this. Peasant villages lost their lands to greedy hacienda owners and ended up working as peones, remember, peons? For example, three families owned a third of Mexican state in Colima, for example. So very unequal, equal rights. Huh? The indigenous people of the Andes lost their village lands too, because landowners bought public property they would kick the people out from where they were living because they were living there for generations without a title. And new owners will take over those properties that they've been, you know, having for generations. It's really sad. And the wages were too small, and there was little time to grow their own food. So women and children had to join the workforce to make up for their um, you know survival. The export boom enriched landowners at the expense of the poor rural people. Gauchos were banished from the pampas in Argentina, and they would put wire fences and that fancy breeds of cattle and sheep, which would transform the open pampa. In 1876, the refrigerator ship carried Argentinian beef to Europe, and they loved it. By the 1900s, there were hundreds of ships wanting to take beef to Europe because there was a huge demand for the Argentinian beef. And I don't know if you guys have tried Argentinian beef is one of the best beefs you can try, but you have to try it in Argentina. I don't know if it's the land or the grass that they feed them. It just melts in your mouth. You just have to put salt and cook it the way they cook it at the right temperature, and that's all they do. They don't put any sauce, no need for A1 sauce or anything, huh? Coffee boomed in the tropics, and coffee grew in, for example, in places like Colombia, Venezuela, Central America, and the Caribbean. In Guatemala, El Salvador, and southern Mexico, indigenous people became workers at coffee plantations owned by foreigners. For example, the Germans owned a lot of these coffee plantations. Family farms profited too. The middle class grew in highland area of Colombia, Costa Rica, and Puerto Rico. Tobacco benefited Brazil and Cuba in a smaller scale, and the owners of sugar refineries were dominated in the rural economy. Um, because of the capital, the owners of many of these major places like Cuban sugar refineries, oil wells pumping Mexican and Venezuelan crude and mines in the high Andes were usually foreign owned. Example in Peru, the U.S. Cerro de Pasco Copper Corporation, which was at 12,000 feet above sea level, uh, was owned by a foreign company, and they had tiny huts where the indigenous miners lived. Really poor conditions. In the rainforest of Amazonia, there was a rubber boom. They started producing rubber for the tires in the United States when the cars started coming up. And the workers always had tiny wages, enough to buy food supplies sold by the rubber company. So imagine they were given money that is their salary is super low, and with that money, they have to pay their company to buy their own food and supplies. So at the end, they ended up with no money at all. Everything was given back to the rubber company because they're the ones who are selling the food to the workers. In Manaus, Brazil, 1,000 mile upriver in Brazil, in the forest, the rubber barons, they built like huge mansions, and they said they even had like opera houses. They would attract touring opera performers, while the indigenous people were dying and ill with diseases, you know, from their horrible life that they had being very poor. So they say people were being decimated by alcohol and disease in those areas, while all these barons are having operas and parties in these mansions. Malaysia becomes a competition for the rubber in Brazil, and many of the barons left the places, their mansions, and never returned. And the workers had to survive on their own after they were gone. The United Fruit Company of the U.S. started operating in Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela. So we have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven countries. Two in South America, Colombia and Venezuela, and then you have one, two, three, four, five in Central America, Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Panama. I hope you can remember that. They created the company towns with managers, engineers, and agronomists from the United States. along with their families, and they will make these miniature neighborhoods, and they look like little enclaves, right, where you have everything. And that did not help the locals at all. It was benefiting the managers and the engineers and the agronomists, I guess, the ones who came from the US to live on those compounds, and the people who are at the top of government in those countries were getting the benefit. But the people, the common local people, were not getting any of the benefit from the foreign companies. They're being exploited as workers. Managerial positions were usually given to the white US personnel, and the natives were hired to do the machete work. They'll be doing the harsh work. Governors and ministers benefited by collaboration with company officials, and when the company pulled out, they left the ex-banana choppers jobless with no land because the land is used, all the fertile land is used, no education, and they say a lot of them have missing limbs and fingers because when they chopped, they don't have the right equipment, and it was very dangerous, and they would chop their fingers as they were chopping the fruit, right? Like the banana company. People migrated to the cities and immigration kept flowing to the cities. For example, they say in Buenos Aires, the city of Buenos Aires had about 100,000 people at the fall of Rosas. Remember Juan Manuel de Rosas, the caudillo dictatorship until 1852. And by the end of the Neo-Colonial Period in 1930, they had 2 million people in Buenos Aires city. Rio de Janeiro was second with just half a million, 500,000 people. Montevideo, Santiago, Havana, and Sao Paulo with a quarter of a million. So you have about 250,000 people in Montevideo, Santiago, Havana, and Sao Paulo. Buenos Aires, Mexico City, and Rio were building big avenues like with the model of Paris. Have you seen Paris streets and big boulevards? That's what they were doing in these cities. And money from crops, livestock, and mines bought mansions and luxuries for the people. Many of the rich became urban people, leaving the hacienda or plantation to the city.